If you're a leader in business today, chances are that you will probably have to manage a remote team. I got 6 tips to help you manage your remote team better, so stay tuned. Welcome back to my channel. My name is Preston and I help professionals just like you build exciting careers and lead awesome teams. If you haven't already, if you're new to the channel, hit the subscribe button below. I have new videos every Tuesday. So managing a remote team, you might approach it and think that you need to look at your management style differently, or you need to act different, or you need to behave different. But I'm gonna give you 6 tips that you can use today that don't require you to completely change your personality or completely change the way that you manage your team. So for those of you that watch my channel, tip number 1 will not be surprising to you. Always set expectations. So if you watch my channel a lot, you know that usually I start with goals or expectations. You need to set goals and expectations for your team on day 1. If your team is permanently remote, the goals and expectations will be pretty easy because they'll be ongoing. If your team is only working remotely for a short period of time, those goals and expectations will have time limits on them. But basically what you want to do is you want to create some goals or expectations as to how often that people will want to check in, which I'll talk about in a minute. You'll want to talk about what your expectation is of workflow and output and approvals. You want to talk about what expectations that you have for the actual amount of work that should be getting done. And a lot of managers and leaders approach working remotely as if they go into it thinking that their employees aren't going to do anything. So go into your conversations with your employees, your goal setting, with the assumption that everyone will be working a full 8 hours. Maybe they'll take a half hour to go get lunch or something like that, but assume that they're going to work those 8 hours when you're having those initial conversations. And a big thing with expectations is tell your team, and a lot of leaders don't do this, even on-site management, tell your team what you're going to be measuring their success against. What are your leading and lagging indicators, and what are the things that at the end of the period when you're done managing them, or when you performance review cycles come around, what are the things that they are going to be measured on that you can say, yes, you were successful, or no, you were not, and then how you can figure out how to adjust that. And at this point too, you want to think about what are the biases that you are carrying as a leader that connect to managing remote employees, because a lot of us come into leadership with biases that we aren't aware of. And if you're going to be managing a team remotely, you need to address what problems or what biases that you have that are going to prevent you from managing your team. So if you're looking for more information on unconscious bias, go back and watch this video. Tip number 2, be predictable. So for some of us who like to be spontaneous like me, this is a little bit difficult, but it is a necessary step. You always want to be predictable with your team, both in the scheduling, so how often are you meeting, predictable in your response time. Are you somebody who responds immediately? Are you someone that is going to be that they're going to have multiple follow-ups with? Be predictable and try to communicate that if you can. Be predictable with what your work schedule will be. So if you're in different time zones, for example, be upfront with, these are the hours that I'm working and I don't work past 6 p.m. because I have a family, or I'm not going to work at this time because of this situation. Be predictable in terms of timing, and be predictable with the amount of in-person contact that you're going to have. At some point, I would say if you're managing a remote team, a lot of managers who manage remote teams kind of just forget about their employees. Either they're super micromanagement or they kind of don't care. But be predictable with your travel schedule, and making sure that if you want to see your team every 6 months, that you're seeing your team every 6 months, whether it's an offsite, retreat or something like that, but always keep those on the schedule so that your team knows what to expect from you. Tip number 3, encourage communication. It is your role to instigate communication, big or small, but you need to instigate that communication. If it's Monday or something's happening, shoot everybody an email and say happy Monday. If there's a project deadline that's late, make sure that you're following up. And you might be thinking, I'm managing this team, why is it my responsibility to constantly have to keep up communications? And what I would say to you is your role is to get the ball rolling and give your team momentum so that you're building a culture of communication and collaboration up front. And for a team that isn't used to working remotely, or if you're new to managing a remote team, it is your role to create the culture. So by communicating more frequently, you are communicating the culture of communication and transparency. So I would say up front, you don't have to be communicating constantly for the rest of time, But at least up front, being overly communicative and trying to get your team comfortable with the idea of always using the appropriate channels to get in contact with you and get in contact with fellow team members is really important, especially when you're setting up a remote culture. And at this point, it would be really, really important for you to talk about the types of things with your team, to talk about the types of things that you expect them to communicate with you about. So are they communicating with you about problems, about ideas? Are they talking to you about what they had for lunch yesterday? What are the types of things that you're expecting them to communicate with you about? And while we're on the topic of communications, I want to say if you haven't signed up for my newsletter yet, the link is below, benjaminpreston.com. Go sign up for my newsletter and I will continue to communicate with you, not overly to the point of being annoying, but I will send you all the necessary leadership and management information that you need to be successful in your role. Okay, tip number 4 is spark impromptu conversations. So one of the benefits of creating a culture in person is that you can walk by someone's desk or you can walk into their office and have kind of impromptu conversations. So, hey Joan, I don't know why I always use Joan as an example, but Joan, how was your weekend? How are your kids doing? Is so-and-so, are they feeling okay? Because I know they were sick last week. Those type of impromptu conversations are really easy to do when you're in person because you can just go bother people. But if you're managing a remote team, it becomes a little bit more difficult because you don't have those sort of sparse interactions. So when you're managing a remote team, you need to create those interactions intentionally. So you're kind of mimicking like the water cooler conversation, like if people go to the cafe and they get water or something and you're just like talking to them, that's what you're trying to mimic, but you're going to do that virtually. The easiest way to do this is to create some sort of forum or chat room or Skype session or something where you and your team can just drop information as it happens. So I know that my team uses Slack, which is really helpful. It's just a forum or a quick chat place where you can drop GIFs or you can drop quick little jokes or something. And so you can kind of create those impromptu conversations. But again, you want to make sure that you're creating the culture of whatever you want that forum to be used for. So if that platform, if you, let's say, have multiple channels set up where you have one that's business, one that's projects, one that's social interactions, maybe it's just a channel dedicated to memes that your team finds on the internet. But make sure that you're creating sort of that culture so that you can have those impromptu sort of interactions. And I would say that you probably want to shoot for 1 to 2 interactions per week so that you're not bombarding your team with totally unnecessary stuff, but at the same time, they're creating that sort of team dynamic. And let me know in the comments below if you have managed or are managing a remote team, what are some impromptu things that you have done that you have found really successful? Let me know in the comments below. Tip number 5, nurture familiarity. So similar to creating an impromptu interactions, you also want to make sure that you create some sort of sense of familiarity, mostly because a lot of digital communications, if it's written, especially if it's written, it's really difficult to determine people's tones or attitudes or things like that. So when you're interacting with your team, make sure that they are familiar with your communication style, how you interact. If you send an email, let's say, and it's call me period, and you send it, make sure that your team isn't going to freak out at the idea that they might be getting fired. And if you're working really closely with your team, creating those I can't even say it. Familiar. You want to create those familiar touch points during your project updates so that your team is aware of your working style and how you prefer to have projects go. So, nurture familiarity. Did I say that right? Tip number 6, and this kind of wraps everything up, but make them feel like they are part of a team. So one of the things that I had to do is I managed a remote team for probably a year and a half, and we were spread out all across the country. One of the things that you have to do when you're managing a team that's very spread out like that is force collaboration, which I know that sounds really weird, but you want to make them feel like they're part of a team, even if they're the only ones at their specific office location. One way that you can do that, and I kind of mentioned this earlier, is if you create sort of on-site retreats and invite your team. But another thing that you can do if you don't have the budget to fly people out to different retreats and things every 2 weeks is try to create a virtual room that you guys can all interact. So if you invite your team on a team update and it's every week or every 2 weeks that you bring everyone together and just say what's going well, what's not going well. My team has used, like I said before, we use Slack for a lot of written communication, but for face-to-face interactions, we use Zoom, which is really good. There's a lot of other video softwares that you can use, like Skype or things like that, or I think like other webinar platforms and things. But bringing everyone back together so that everyone feels like they're part of the team and they actually get to see each other's faces, that's really, really important. And as part of this, you can encourage collaboration across multiple projects. So for example, on the team that I was managing, there was a lot of room for people to cross-collaborate. They were part of the same function, but they were owning different projects. So you can kind of facilitate more teamwork and collaboration. So if you've noticed that team, person A and person C they don't usually have a lot of projects together, try to figure out something where they can work together and start building that relationship. But as you start building those networks and start building those relationships within your team, you'll notice that people start to feel a lot more like they're a part of something as opposed to just individuals working on projects in tandem. And the last part of making them feel like a team is recognizing them publicly when they do something well. Recognizing your talent, the talent that's on your team, and making sure that everyone is aware or giving kudos to people when they go above and beyond, or just when they hit their metrics. That's always really exciting too, because it gives your team something to cheer about, and it reinforces that culture of positivity, and it reinforces the idea that people are going to be recognized for their work, even if they're not seen every day. And managing a team remotely is really odd for some leaders and some managers because they don't really feel like they fit the role. If you feel like you're struggling with your identity as a leader, go back and watch this video. It'll help you in your approach, feel like more of a boss and more of a leader to your team so that you're not shying away from that position, especially when you have to manage a remote team. And that is all that I have. Hopefully a quick video. I hope this is relevant. I hope it's timely. I know that a lot of you will probably be having a lot more remote teams recently. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe, leave me a comment. I want to connect with all of you. And if you haven't done so already, make sure to sign up for my newsletter.